I just want to cover quickly an additional type of light that we haven't really talked about, because honestly it's not actually a type of light, it's rather an abuse of a type that we have seen. It is basically hacking ourselves an ambient light. Now, in earlier versions of Lightwave, what you used to have in the lighting options was an ambient light option, which basically just added a base, completely even light to everything. Basically, if you added a couple of % ambient, it made absolutely nothing go pure black. Everything had some degree of illumination, but it had no shading or anything else. Being all physical, then that's no longer available to us in current Lightwave version, and some have missed it, but there is a way that we can sort of get it back, and that is, as I say, by abusing an environment light. So let's just add one here. You see, I've already got a couple of lights in the scene, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn those off temporarily so as we can focus on our environment light. At the minute, you see, of course, there's an environment light and it's sending light in through the window, but what we want is ambient light, and to get that it's pretty simple. All we do is we uncheck the shadows for our environment light. This means that it just, lights evenly over everything, except we see that it's not entirely even because we are getting shading of surfaces. This is due to, of course, the way that surfaces work. As we saw in foundations, we've got things like roughness, that attenuates the way a diffuse is picked out and stuff like that, right? There's Fresnel effects in both specular and diffuse and so on and so forth. So we will always get something, some kind of shading when using an environment light this way. Usually, of course, it's not only the shadows that we want to turn off, it's also the specular, because, of course, that will just reflect this block lighting in, any reflective surfaces, which you're normally not wanting. You're normally only wanting to add to the diffuse channel. As it happens, we don't have an awful lot of specular stuff in this scene, apart from that little bit of chrome that was on this thing over here that you can now see has gone black. But how to use the ambient light or the environment light as an ambient light to its best advantage? There's a couple of ways. First of all, we can sample backdrop, but let's turn that off for a minute, because what you used to have with ambient light, of course, was that it was just a single block colour. And so, of course, you could set that here just using the good old light colour. And of course, if we have that, then this is just even white light from all directions. But because of the slightly different angles and the diffuse properties of some of these principled shaders that we've got, we see that it does still create a bit of shading, even though we've got no shadows and purely even light everywhere. But the best thing that you can do with it is to use sample backdrop. And essentially this is because you can sort of texture an environment light, or rather you can sort of texture an ambient light. Now, if you're using another environment light that's actually casting from backdrop, then you've only got the one backdrop of choice. What I'm going to show you here is most useful on interiors, such as the shot that we're looking at here. And what we can see, if we look at the backdrop editor, then we've got the blue sky down to the brown ground, which is, pretty much standard, right? So we just throw those other two lights on so that we can see what goes on here. And of course, we've got, because of the way the light's coming in, we've got this bright strip across the middle, and it's sort of darker up towards the ceiling and darker still down on the floor. So let's go back to our backdrop, switch those lights around a bit, and we'll set the top here to be this sort of, darkened greyish colour, coming down to a more medium grey there, and at the ground level perhaps we'll have it as a white, and then at the nadir, so the undercolour, we'll go back to a darker grey again. Then you can see we sort of get this, slightly differentiated lighting. These could be colours if we wanted them to be, but not necessarily. So if we add our, actual lights, so to speak, back on, then okay, that's all there. And we take our environment, and we don't want it at full brightness, right? We'll want to reduce it somewhat. So, I don't know, maybe 0.1. And you can see that what this is starting to give us is a little bit of sort of fake GI-like fill. Perhaps we'll go a little brighter with it, 0.15 there. What we are essentially doing is just, of course, lifting out some of the shadows so everything isn't black, just like ambient light always used to do. But it is ever so slightly shaded. Now, of course, as a replacement for GI, this is pretty poor. It doesn't look very GI-like at all. However, when we combine this with actual GI, then it can start to bring us a couple of benefits. Firstly, it gives a little bit more light in the scene for the GI to work with, since the GI bounces light around. We'll see more of that shortly. And because it's just flat and plain, it always renders smoothly, so we can start to get a bit of less noise, smoother renders in dark corners and nooks and crannies, things of that sort. It can often help quite well if we're using interpolated radiosity. Interpolated radiosity, as we will see, can sometimes have the odd problem in, certain little areas. Having a little bit of extra light as a kicker can be quite useful. Can help keep things smooth, can help add an extra little bit of shading, nuance and detail. And indeed, it can also help us to reduce our bounces somewhat. One of the things that costs during a GI render is the number of bounces. Sometimes by using a little ambient kick, that gives us an extra ray in there already for the radiosity to play with. And so we can often bring our GI rays down somewhat. Or should I say our GI bounces down. And as such, that helps us to get faster GI renders without losing all brightness in the darker corners and spaces that the GI has failed to reach because it doesn't have sufficient bounces. Something that you can plainly see when we compare this here, which is using the little ambient light trick, compared to what we get when not using it. And you see we get much darker shadows in some of these places where it's going, of course, total black due to no light reaching there. So there we go, that's how to do the old ambient style lighting in 2018 in the new renderer. Not something that's going to solve all manner of problems, but it can be a useful little trick, and we will see it in context in later videos in this series.